The church is a corporate body, not merely a collection of individuals, and therefore it needs some sort of an structure and organization to operate well and fulfill its mission. In 1 Timothy chapter 3, Paul turns to the issue of the requirements to be a leader in the church, and he discusses these in verses 1 through 13. In the Bible, we basically see two levels of leadership. The top level, which are those who are the ones who set the policy, do the preaching and teaching, and so on, are called either overseers or elders. The Greek words are episkopos and presbyteros. They're used interchangeably in the Bible. Sometimes they're translated as bishops, and they are equivalent as well to pastors. A different word is used for pastor, which is found in the book of Ephesians. That's the word poimen, which basically means shepherd. But these terms essentially stand for those people who are in the top leadership position in an individual church or who have leadership over a number of churches. The second level of leadership are called the deacons, the Greek word diakonos, which essentially means a helper, a servant, an assistant. And so typically the role of the deacons in the New Testament church would be to provide assistance to the overseers or elders and take care of the physical needs of the people. The role of the deacon got its start in Acts chapter 5, Acts chapter 6. So Paul discusses the requirements to be an elder or overseer in 1 Timothy 3, verses 1 through 7, and then the requirements to be a deacon in verses 8 through 13. And I'm going to concentrate most of my time in this lecture on the requirements to be an elder or overseer, and the reason is the requirements to be an elder and to be a deacon are essentially exactly the same. As we go through the requirements to be an elder or overseer, we'll see that Paul repeats the same kind of language when he's talking about the role of the deacons in verses 8 through 13. There's actually only one major difference between the two roles, namely that one of the requirements to be in the top level of leadership in a church is the ability to teach. That is not required of deacons. However, deacons may well be able to teach. It's just not required for their position. And we know that because when the original 7 deacons were chosen in Acts chapter 6, Philip was a deacon, and he was a good teacher, as we learn later in the book of Acts. Stephen was a good teacher, as we learn from his very lengthy speech in Acts chapter 7. So, let's begin. I'll read 1 Timothy 3, verses 1 through 7, and then we'll talk about this. Paul says, "It is a trustworthy statement. If any man aspires to the office of overseer, it is a fine work he desires to do. An overseer, then, must be above reproach, the husband of one wife, temperate, prudent, respectable, hospitable, able to teach, not addicted to wine or pugnacious, but gentle, peaceable, free from the love of money. He must be one who manages his own household well, keeping his children under control with all dignity. But if a man does not know how to manage his own household, how will he take care of the church of God? And not a new convert, so that he will not become conceited and fall into the condemnation incurred by the devil. And he must have a good reputation with those outside the church, so that he will not fall into reproach and the snare of the devil." So let's take a look at these requirements. He begins by saying that if a person desires to do the work of an overseer or a leader in the church, it's a fine work he desires to do. Now, so it's not wrong to aspire to church leadership. But then he goes on to say in verse 2, an overseer then must. And Paul lists 15 requirements. But there's something interesting that I think we need to understand about this. When he lists these 15 requirements, he's not saying that to be a leader in the church, you need to meet 1 or 2 or 5 or even a majority of them. He's saying that a leader in the church needs to meet all of them. It's important to realize here that we all have strengths and weaknesses. And so one of the things, when Paul was starting churches and Timothy was starting churches, they always appointed multiple elders. The whole idea that, and I know this is true in some churches where somebody says, I am the pastor, everything has to go through me. That is not a biblical idea. This whole idea of one-man leadership is false. And so, because, in the Bible it points out, iron sharpens iron. A person might be a good preacher, but a poor administrator. A person might be a good administrator, but a poor counselor. And that's why we need multiple leaders. Because we all have strengths, we all have weaknesses. And when you have multiple leaders, as the old saying goes, 2 heads are better than 1. We all are products of our background and training, and there are just things that all of us may overlook because, we're not familiar with it. We're not trained, whereas other people are. And so, biblically, the church always was based upon multiple elders or overseers. And so, the other thing that I think is very important to note about the 15 requirements here, because if we have multiple leaders, they should get together regularly and help hold each other to account, and those who are strong in one area should work to build up those who are weak in a particular area. The other thing that is important to note is that all of the requirements that Paul lists, with the possible exception of the ability to teach and of not being a new convert, they are all requirements that every Christian should have. And even the requirement of not being a new convert, that will take care of itself over time. Note that there are no special requirements to be a leader in the church related to your level of education, your job, your material wealth, your tribe, or anything like that. All those are external matters. Instead, all of the requirements Paul lists relate to your character. And just think about this. Earlier in chapter 1, in verses 9 and 10, Paul listed 15 examples of unrighteous people for whom the law is made. But now, in the New Covenant, we're not under the old law. And it's interesting that you look at the 15 requirements Paul gives here in these first 7 verses of chapter 3. They point to a person who is the exact opposite in character of the person who is subject to the law. And because we are subject to the law of Christ. And so, leaders in the church, everyone has a right to look to the leadership. And if you look at those 15 requirements, and we'll talk about them in a minute, if you have all of those, and you develop them, those are people who have the character of Christ. Because we should be able to look to our leaders. We have the right to look to our leaders. And when we look to them, we should see Christ in them. And just think, if we took this seriously when we're choosing leaders in the church, and we chose people not on the basis of the money they have, not on the basis of their job, not on the basis of their tribe, or any of these external matters, but chose them on the basis of what God's Word says, I think our churches would look considerably different than they are today. And also, I think that Jesus would start speaking to the churches and speaking to the leadership, because he would see, Ah, now you're taking my words seriously. You are appointing men and women to the positions of leadership in my church who have my character. Therefore, they will hear my voice. So I will speak to them and lead them. And I can expect that if we chose leaders who look like this, we can expect Christ to lead us and our churches to be doing things that they're probably not doing right now. Because people who have the character like this, number one, are not going to betray you. Number two, they are not me-centered. They are church-centered, and they are others-centered. So, let's take a look at these requirements. He begins by saying, to be a leader in the church, you need to be above reproach. Now, often in the Bible, when there is a list of things, very often the first thing that is mentioned is the most important, and sometimes it kind of summarizes the rest. Take a look at the fruit of the Spirit in Galatians chapter 5. The fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, long-suffering, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. The first one listed is love, and you can look at love as summarizing all the rest. All the rest are sort of like aspects of what love looks like. I think it's true here, where the first requirement is that a person be above reproach, which simply means that no one can legitimately accuse you of wrongdoing. It's kind of like John, the Apostle John in 1 John chapter 1 uses the metaphor of walking in the light. Think about light. Light gives life. Light enables us to see where we're going and so on. And that's the way leaders should be. But the other thing about light is transparent. You can't hide anything in it. And it's the same with being above reproach. A person who's above reproach is the same on the inside as he or she is on the outside. He doesn't put on a mask or a false face when he speaks to you. That's the way a real Christian leader should be. Then he says, the next requirement is the husband of one wife. Now, this does not mean that a person has to be married in order to be a leader in the church. But if he or she is married, they should be married to only one spouse, not be a polygamist. Now, polygamists in Africa, there are a lot of polygamists who are Christians, and they can have important roles in the church. But what Paul is saying is they should not be in the top level of leadership. Why not? Because, again, the leaders point to Christ. Christ spoke about marriage and said from the very beginning, God created people male and female, and he said the two are one. He didn't say the three or four are one. And what God has joined together, let no man put asunder. Jesus is called the bridegroom, and we are called his bride. So Jesus is married to the church. He's not married to the church and to the world. He's not married to the church and to the mosque. He pours out all of himself for us. He has sacrificed himself for his bride. And that's the way a married leader should look. Now, we know that a leader of the church doesn't have to be married because Jesus was not married physically, and Paul was not married. He may have been a widower, but he's not married. And they obviously are qualified to be leaders in the church. But the literal Greek, our Bibles translate the second requirement as married to one wife. The actual literal Greek is a one-woman man. And I think that's important because you can be married to your spouse but not be a one-woman man. Why? Well, if you have a girlfriend on the side, or you visit prostitutes, or, as Jesus points out, if you lust after somebody in your heart, you've already committed adultery with her in your heart. Paul is saying, to be a leader in the church, you need to be committed to your spouse and be a one-woman man. Not be unfaithful to her either physically, with a prostitute, or mentally and emotionally in your mind, like with pornography or something like that. But then he says, to be a leader in the church, you need to be temperate and prudent. These words convey the idea of being sober-minded, having a sound mind and sound judgment. We need that if we are to be a leader in the church. And by the way, towards the end of chapter 3 in verse 11, Paul is talking about women leaders, he uses the same word. They are to be temperate. In verse 12, regarding deacons, he said, they also are to be a one-woman man. So as I said, Paul is using the same requirements for both levels of leadership in the church. Then he says that to be a leader in the church, you need to be respectable. Now, it's the same word that was translated in chapter 2, verse 9, that one should dress modestly. The basic meaning of respectable is orderly. Sometimes it's translated honorable. Essentially, leaders should ask themselves, am I worthy of respect? Most people look up to the leaders, but if people saw what we did in secret, would they still respect us? In other words, am I worthy of respect? It goes back to being above reproach. If what I do in secret is not worthy of respect, then I'm really not respectable. People may respect me because they don't know what I'm really like. You see, what Paul is getting at is to be a real leader, it shows who you are on the inside as well as who you are on the outside. Then he says, to be a leader, you need to be hospitable. Hospitable essentially means that we love and care for people and strangers. Now this is important because a leader needs to know his people well. You need to know your people's hopes and dreams, their strengths, their weaknesses, their fears, their problems, all of these things. You have to spend time with your people. I was in a church for many years where the pastor just had a small group of his friends, didn't really know most of the people in his congregation. That is not the mark of a biblical leader. We need to spend time with them. And I know in Africa, many pastors are expected to provide tea and food and so on for people when they come to the house. And yet, the churches might not have a budget for that. The churches need to budget that because a leader, one of the requirements is that a leader be hospitable. So the church has to enable the pastor and the church leaders to do their jobs. Now, the next requirement is that the leader needs to be able to teach. This, again, is the one difference really between the overseer or elder, bishop, pastor position and that of the deacons. It then goes on to say that to be a leader, you should not be addicted to wine. And the word here means given to or addicted. In other words, a drunkard. Again, in chapter 3, verse 8, it applies the same type of requirement to deacons. Now, we need to understand something. Paul's culture was a wine-drinking culture. Everybody, men, women, and children, drank wine. Now, I know that many cultures today are alcohol-drinking cultures. I mean, Germany is a beer-drinking culture, and Russia is a vodka-drinking culture, and France and Italy and so on are wine-drinking cultures. Now, I know that within most churches in East Africa, they are not drinking cultures. But the issue is not the wine. You see, and so we concentrate on the wine, but the issue is not that. The issue is being addicted to something, okay? Because I've known of pastors who didn't drink at all, yet they were addicts. What were they addicted to? They were addicted to power, to manipulation and control, to always getting their own way, addicted to fame. And I'll tell you something, those addictions are far more dangerous than being addicted to wine. You see, when you're addicted to something, you don't control it. It controls you. And what Paul is saying is, and he was using a common, perhaps the most common thing that people are addicted to in a wine-drinking culture, but, and so he was using a common example. But again, look to the principle here. The only thing we should be addicted to is Jesus Christ, okay? Now, he then goes on to say, to be a leader, you should not be pugnacious, which means violent, or a fighter, or a striker, but gentle and peaceable. Now, Most leaders are not violent with their hands and their fists, but you can be a fighter. You can be violent with your words, the way you speak to people, even the way you look at them. And a lot of people in formal positions of leadership are like that. Instead, we need to be gentle. Now, a lot of people think the word gentle is just a term for being weak. Not true at all. Jesus said, I am gentle and lowly at heart. Was Jesus a weak man? Not at all. You know, when he was being accused before Pilate, Pilate was amazed. He didn't say anything in response. That was not because he was weak. No. It takes real strength of character to be able to take the insults that people will dish upon you and not strike back. Okay? It's a mark, again, it's a mark of your character. Instead, we're to be peaceable. That indicates we should be peacemakers. Jesus said, blessed are the peacemakers. Many leaders say, it's my way or the highway. That is not the mark of a Christian leader. No. The Christian leader, we should be seeking the mind of Christ, we should be seeking the guidance of the Holy Spirit, and we should be seeking to bring people together. Because if you're in a board meeting, a meeting with the other church leaders, and we're talking about doing this or that for the church, and if there's a great division among the leaders, many pastors will say, we're going to do this. No, that's not a peacemaker. Because if there's great division, that tells me that you do not know the mind of Christ on this issue. You need to table the matter. Pray about it. And again, we talked in an earlier lecture, listen to some of the people on the board. Perhaps the person you really don't like. That's the very person that God will speak to you through. You see, again, these are a matter of your character. Are you more concerned about the church and seeking the will of God, or are you more concerned about your own will? Then, he says, to be a leader, you need to be free from the love of money. Again, chapter 3, verse 8, the same requirement applies to deacons. Now, this is a matter of character. It doesn't say you have to be poor, because the love of money is an internal thing. You can be poor, and yet, if you're looking, if I only had money, that would be my salvation. You have the love of money. But you can be rich. You can have more than you need, and yet you never have enough. I just need a little more. It's an internal thing. So you need to think, what do you spend your time thinking about? What do you do with your money? Is it all about you? A lot of church leaders, it's all about getting a big house, a big car, fancy clothes. That tells me they really have the love of money. It's all about them. Paul will speak more about this in chapter 6, but this is a huge requirement. Again, Paul is getting to the heart of matters, getting to the heart of a person's character. Then he says, to be a leader in the church, you need to manage your household well. Because he goes on to say, if you can't manage your physical household, how do you expect to manage the household of God? Now, your spouse, your children may do what you say, but the question is, why? Do they do it out of fear or out of love and respect? And again, that's why you need to know your people. If you're considering appointing a person to a position of leadership in the church, you need to know that person well. You need to spend time at their house. See how they interact with their family. It'll give you an idea as to whether they manage their household well. Because to manage the house, that word well is important. It's not just managing the household, you do what I say. No, it's managing it well so that people do what you say because what you say is right, because you have the character of Christ, because they love you, respect you, and they want to do it that way. And then he says, you should not be a new convert. And again, why? It goes to your character, because he says that if you are a new convert, you're likely to get puffed up and conceited and fall into condemnation. You see, if you give somebody too much authority too soon, it may go to their head. That's why later in this book, chapter 5, he talks about not laying hands on anyone too hastily. In other words, not ordaining someone for ministry. The same thing applies to deacons. in chapter 3, verse 10, he says, let these men also first be tested. So you need to know your people. Test them. And then you give somebody a little bit of responsibility. See how he does. If he does well, give him a little more responsibility. See how he does. That's the mark of a good leader. And finally, the last requirement here is to be a leader in the church, you need to have a good reputation with those outside of the church. Why? Because the church does not just exist for itself. It exists to be the salt of the earth, the light of the world. You see, the church is to be in the world, even though it is not of the world. It doesn't have the same mindset and operate on the same principles and have the same goals as the world. You see, consequently, the reputation we have among non-believers is of vital importance. What they see in us will either draw them closer to Christ or push them away from Christ. Paul ends this list of 15 requirements in verse 7 the same way he began. He said, you need to have a good reputation with people outside the church so that he will not fall into reproach and the snare of the devil. He began by talking about, to be a leader, you need to be above reproach. And so, just think, I know in many churches in East Africa and elsewhere, leaders in the church are afraid to raise up new leaders because they think, if I raise that person up, yes, he's a good preacher or a good teacher or whatever. If I raise him up, though, he'll get a big head and a big following and he'll leave the church and take most of the people and their money along with him. Well, just think about this. If your leaders looked like the people that Paul is talking about here, those are the kind of people who will never betray you. Why? Because they have the character of Christ. So this is what we need to concentrate on when we're choosing leaders. In the last couple of minutes, let me just say a little bit more about the deacons in verses 8 through 13. I've already pointed out how the role of deacons began in the beginning of Acts chapter 6. They concentrate on the physical needs of the people, and we've already seen how most of the same terms that Paul used for overseers and elders apply to the deacons. Now, in verse 8, it talks about that they should be people of dignity. And in matter of fact, the word dignity is the only word common when Paul talks about the qualifications of elders, verse 4, deacons, verse 8, and women leaders, verse 11. To be dignified or to have dignity. In other words, it is a person who is worthy of special respect. Again, you're looking at somebody's character. It tells of the deacons they should not be double-tongued. In other words, they need to be sincere. You know, their word is their bond. And they should hold to the mystery of the faith with a clear conscience. The mystery of faith, of course, refers to all that is said about, our salvation through God, by God's grace, through faith in Jesus Christ. He will talk more about the mystery of faith at the end of chapter 3. We'll talk about that in the next lecture. But he says, with a clear conscience. Remember, the goal is to have love from a good conscience. So, you see, our internals should match our externals. And finally, the word, he talks about women leaders in verse 11. And now the word women in the Greek, it can refer to women in general or wives. So there is some dispute among scholars. Is he talking about deacons' wives or female deaconesses? We see, for example, in the Bible, in Romans 16, verse 1, Phoebe, who is called a servant, that word in Greek is diakonos, which is normally translated deacon. So it seemed what Paul seems to be saying is that there are women leaders, men leaders, they're all basically have the same requirements. And even the word for men is not limited to males,